Hello, Steve. Welcome to the Emil Barna Podcast. It's an absolute honor to have you on board today. I've been following your work for quite a few years as a therapist, and as many in my field will definitely attest to, your work and your discoveries along the years have definitely flavored the type of work that we do in our discipline. So I can't thank you enough for the work that you do, but I'm really excited to have you on board just to level some questions to you. Before I do that though, I would like to give you a moment to just introduce whatever it is that you'd like to introduce about yourself to our audience who may not have heard about you.
Well, thank you, Emil. It's a pleasure to be on. It's a long distance between us physically, and the good part of that story is there's no jet lag, so we're here together. To introduce me, okay, I created the Polyvagal Theory. That's a fact, and we'll talk about that. It will be the theme. I have been an academic for my, I would say, professional life. I've been a professor in many departments or several departments: psychology, human development, psychiatry. I've held appointments in biomedical engineering and other programs. I've had an academic research career and for decades, and doing human research and some animal research. And I developed methodologies for quantifying autonomic nervous system and hold, I think, about 7 patents on methodologies to both monitor and influence autonomic state. But really, the dream for an academic is for their work to basically have impact on the society in which we're in, to do good. Some of us were kind of, let's say, seduced by the academic worldview or profession of saying we can do things that will help the world, make the world a better place. And my narrative in being seduced into that narrative was, can we help optimize the human experience? And that's really what I've focused on. Can we learn about what it is to be a human? And can we give directives in terms of how we structure our lives without blaming people?
Yes, and you do that really well, which is evident in the publications that have come about from the work that you've done. Many people have picked up on your themes and applied them, practically speaking. They've helped thousands and thousands of people that you've trained. I think on your website, you've trained over 1,000 therapists in...
I haven't directly trained. So I have come up with the ideas of the intervention, the safe and sound protocol, which we'll talk about. I think there are over 4,000 therapists have been trained. And at the moment, at any given moment, there's over 2,000 who are utilizing the technology. And that intervention was based on the theory. And we'll talk about that because it's a stealth intervention. And the word stealth is important for those who are interested in dealing with individuals who have traumatic histories, adverse effects, because in a clinical setting, and you can actually attest to this, is that frequently you're throwing cues that trigger defenses in your clients. What if you could throw cues of safety and trust? What would happen? And that was really the motivation behind developing the safe and sound protocol. But I learned a lot more from that, because I learned that when you have a severe adversity history, even signals or cues of safety and trust are triggers, because they really signal the body that they're vulnerable. Because what is trust and safety? It's being accessible. And accessibility is really, in a sense, this quality of being a human that enables us to bond and interact and feel comfortable with others. So this becomes a goal in most people's lives. And when they don't have that feeling of accessibility or accessible to another, their bodies recoil and they feel unsafe in the presence of others.
Yeah, any therapist who has dealt with anybody who has experienced a significant amount of stress or trauma, or just any person in general who may see that in other people that they love or people in the community, will be able to attest to how small things can really have a large impact, both positively and negatively. I want to take a step back and discuss polyvagal theory in brief, because you mentioned that you conceived of this theory and you were able to adapt that to adapt the safe and sound protocol to that framework and make it as practical as possible. Einstein once said, "We must make things as simple as possible, but not simpler." And you have been compared to Einstein when it comes to the nervous system. I think that's a pretty accurate representation in terms of how you really changed the landscape for so many people. But let's
be a little bit careful here, because when developing the polyvagal theory, there's a difference between creating and discovering. So even though I may be considered the creator of the theory, it's really not a creation. It's an understanding of what it is to be a human or to be a living organism. And so it's really built on, I would say, the backs of giants, that's what Google, when you do Google Scholar, pops up on the backs of giants. And really that there always have been smart people, and they just were not, I would say, alive at the time when the information was available to make sense out of their observations. So they used different metaphors. They saw it, and it's like there've always been healers, been people that we have always gone to in society. There are certain cues they throw off, but it has never been extracted in terms of neurophysiology. But when you can extract that neurophysiology, you see the program in front of you, and you see the deficits, and now you can start dealing with a strategic way of intervening. So the other part of this is in retrospect. So let me kind of put this in a little perspective. In 1994, when this kind of came out, it was my presidential address to the Society of Psychophysiological Research. And in my own mind, and it's still in my own mind, I saw this as derivative. I didn't see it as paradigm shifting. I saw it as the obvious next step. Okay. Now it's taken, what is this now, 27 years since the conference. And now I kind of reflect back and say, that was a bright guy. It's like I think backwards. And how did he come up with those ideas? Or he, trying to go through the stages of thought that went through. And what I realized, the difference between who I am or who I was and my colleagues, was that I was reaching across disciplines. I was unencumbered, unshackled by my own discipline. And I basically searched all disciplines and became conversant in the language of many applied areas, including many of the sub-disciplines of medicine, because I was seeking an understanding from people who observed the organism, meaning the human, in different settings. I was trying to figure out, like, why did a baby have clinical bradycardia and stop breathing and their hearts get too slow? Why during delivery is this a challenge? What were the neural mechanisms? Could it be monitored? And could you intervene before it would be lethal? So these were, in a sense, practical questions that I thought I was on the verge of creating a language to understand. The metaphor that I would rather give you, which is actually the easy one, is a Rubik's Cube. Okay, if you think of each of the sides of the cube as being a different discipline, they could even be literature or mythology, it could be neurobiology, it could be anatomy, it could be psychology. Basically, there are different surfaces that we have a language for, but there are core principles that are embedded in all those surfaces. And polyvagal theory is like, in my mind, visualize a person trying to solve a Rubik's Cube. I'm turning these things around and I could see things. Now, I saw things that obviously other people didn't see, but it wasn't like it was, to me, startling. It just made sense. Yeah. So I had this I would say, a very practical way of seeing things, plus I would say, an enthusiasm, a creativity, and a real need to discover. You know, it wasn't like, oh, I can't do something different. I said, doing something different is the fun part of the game. Learning something and not confirming other people, but pushing the envelope, going further, basically learning. And I started to realize that that was the motivation. The motivation was a deep motivation to understand the human experience. I was very, I would say, I wouldn't say shocked, but surprised would be a better word, that the first group that grabbed on to polyvagal theory was the world of trauma, because it gave a narrative to the experience of those who had been severely traumatized, and they didn't have a narrative before. And suddenly they understood what their body was doing. And now it was not an issue of shame and blame. It was an issue of honoring a body that enabled them to survive. And that became a story, a heroic story. And it's really been interesting from a humanistic perspective. I would say from the accessible, authentic aspect of who I am, to hear the stories of people who have had such severe histories, but were able to make their life meaningful once they understood what their body was doing in their nervous system. They were no longer angry anymore, no longer disappointed, and they could put it back together again.
Tell us, what is polyvagal theory?
The least welcome question. You asked me if there are any questions I don't like. I would say that is the number one, because it could be a couple of days of lectures. It could get me going. So I try to simplify it now, and I basically try to say the most important thing, if you remember something from our dialogue, is that our physiological state influences how we respond to the world. And if we accept that and start realizing that not all our behavior is intentional, sometimes our physiological state gets so worked up that intentionality just leaves the table. It's gone. And we act out. We use terms like acting out, or someone will say grow up, use terms like that. And what they're really saying is use your higher brain structures to regulate your behavior. They forget that when you hit a certain physiological state, you don't have that kind of control. It doesn't exist. Your body is in a state of threat, and in a state of threat, it's going to try to protect itself. Itself is a physical reality. And so the abusive behavior that may start coming out of someone who's challenged is really not necessarily intentional. So when we start dealing in a therapeutic world, we start to try to get people to separate intentionality from feelings. So if people can say, I'm feeling very, let's use the term, disorganized, I am in a sense destabilized, I need to be in a place where I don't interact with other people, or I need to be in a place in which I interact with someone I trust, that I can co-regulate, calm down. The other important part is that we learn, not only is that physiological state, that thing that's in between the context and our responses, the intervening variable, but we learn that through evolution, and this becomes the important part of the theory, it's very dependent upon how vertebrate anatomy and neuroanatomy changed, and that we evolved from asocial reptiles to social mammals. And when we did this, or when this evolutionary event occurred, some very, I would say, beautiful things occurred. We were able to have on board in our nervous system a pathway, a control system that got us out of threat. Where reptiles are more primitive vertebrates, they either appear not to be in fight or flight, they're not combative, but they're not calm through proximity of others. They're like zoned out. Mammals do something very interesting. They have reactions to threat, but they also have reactions to cues of safety. And if you don't believe me, if you want a different visualization, a young baby who's crying and is agitated is in a physiological state of fight flight. The mother touches the baby and uses a prosodic voice, a voice with intonation and a mother's lullaby, the classic sounds, and the baby's body calms down. And this is the act of co-regulation. But it's not just the baby calming down, the mother's calming down too. And when they hug each other, there's this mutuality or co-regulation. But what you learn is that with social mammals, and we can talk about ourselves, and we can generalize even to our dogs and cats and horses, that vocalizations are powerful, facial expressivity is powerful, gestures are powerful. And what happened on that wonderful evolutionary journey, the neuroregulation of our viscera, primarily through that a massive nerve called the vagus, became intertwined in the brainstem with the nerves that regulated the face, the muscles of the face and head, including our vocalizations, our ability to listen, and our ability to broadcast, not just in our voice, but in our facial expressivity. So it became intertwined. And what that did was it elevated sociality to a neuromodulator. So just like you might want to get an electrical stimulus, so there's a lot of interest in vagal nerve stimulation. Sociality is a vagal nerve stimulator. It's wired that way. That's what it is. And being a vagal nerve stimulator, it downregulates our threat reactions. That's the theory. Oh, the theory has lots of other words, terms, and stuff. So I did a recent book. It's called Polyvagal Safety, and I decided I would start to kind of outline the stages of the theory, what was put into it, and what were the critical papers that introduced these concepts. So the concept like the social engagement system, the vagal brake, neuroception, the nervous system's detection of risk. This became a big one because when people are affected by adverse events, especially if they're, let's say, raped or mugged, they will think that they get angry at themselves for missing the cues. In a sense, they basically think they didn't perceive it accurately, rather than talking about a nervous system that didn't detect the cues or detected cues of safety or detected cues of threat. Detection is not the same intentionality as perception. So I took it out of the realm of cognition because that got kind of sucked in with this concept of responsibility and intentionality. I gave it a role within the nervous system to detect, especially detect cues of threat, because that has to occur long before we start to think about what the cues are, or we wouldn't be a species. So cues of threat are easy to detect in terms of understanding that's how survival occurs. But mammals detect cues of safety, and that makes them remarkable. And that's how relationships are formed. That's how trusting activity. Unfortunately, in our Western world, we're so, I would say, syntax centric. We're focused on the language and not on the intonation of the voice that really changes how we feel about people. We think it's all in the words. And then we say, I didn't really like that person, but, I agreed with everything they said. And when you have those moments, you understand. And then you can say, really, I really like that person and I don't agree with what they're saying. What's that all about? And we have those situations occurring also because our bodies get really, our bodies prioritize, our nervous system prioritize cues of safety long, or I would say much more than it prioritizes content of the statements.
It certainly does. It seems that essentially it's a body-based focus rather than a top-down focus on understanding what's going on.
It gets confusing when you start talking body focus versus top-down, bottom-up, because in reality, neuroception is going top-down, then goes body up, but you're aware of body up and you're not aware of top-down. So what happens is that, let's say with threat, your body goes into a physiological state. You don't know what the cues of threat were. You just know your body is agitated. That's interoception, goes to a level of awareness. The neuroception of detection of risk isn't there, but you can feel the body. And that creates problems in our day-to-day relationships. Because let's say we're sitting across from each other and there's a series of cues in the ambient environment that triggers in me a sense of threat. A siren, in many cases, it can just be background sounds of mechanicals, low frequency sounds of rumble. And low frequency sounds of rumble are evolutionarily linked to threat reactions. So, when people, if they're in buildings that have vibrations, they may feel very agitated, but they feel agitated, but they don't know why. But they may think it's because you're sitting across from them. And they start building that type of narrative. So we have to, in a sense, understand there's a top down that we're not aware of, but the bottom up part we are aware of. So we respect what our body's telling us. And at that level, we can call it the bottom up model.
So it seems that something can be picked up in the environment and beneath conscious awareness, and it makes you feel a particular way. And then the person tries to make sense of what's going on. And then they see someone else around them, and then they try to, or something else that's going on, and then they attribute it to that. And that just colors those particular situations. Or
let's say you have a deadline. Or let's say you have a deficit in your monthly bit and you're, in a sense, not feeling good. And someone's in your presence and your face is flat and your voice doesn't have its prosody, and you're projecting that at the person and their face goes blank because they're being hit with all those cues. And now you're really having to understand, because they're not sending you cues of love and trust, they're sending you cues of threat. And now, because they feel threatened by you, but you don't know that, you know that they're sending cues to you. You pick that up and you get upset with them. And the real issue is you've been upset. You just didn't know why, or you didn't. Your physiology was in a state of defensiveness, and your narrative had to make sense out of it. And so in a therapeutic model, what one wants to do is take a time out, stop, feel the body before you explain why you feel a certain way. And even in a therapeutic setting, I know on social friendship modes, people will always tell you why they don't feel good. They don't say, I don't feel good. It's irrelevant why I don't feel good. The model I like to always kind of discuss is people who have chronic anxieties, meaning they always are saying, if I got this done, if I get that paper submitted, if I get that grant, life's going to be different. No, they'll find something else because their physiology keeps them moving. And it's not a timeline of accomplishments. That's not the goal. I mean, academics is really, I would say, a wonderful playground to observe. Not only participate, but also observe.
So picking up on that theme, then, is it that they're driven by their physiological arousal that may or may not be precipitated by stress, or is it just that I just want to become a better version of myself, so I'm just going to continuously just expand what I do? We see this all the time with people.
It doesn't make a better version of yourself unless your version of yourself is productivity oriented. It's accumulation of stuff or finances or publications or grants. If a better version of yourself is being a nicer person, being more helpful, more comfortable with yourself, a better friend, a better parent, a person who can listen to another without telling them what that other person should have done. We have to understand what it is. If we have to have a template of what being a better person means to us. We also have to have a template of what life's goals are. As I said, I use the academic playground because that's really all I have known. And when I hit about 50, I really was extraordinarily concerned about the end game, because I looked around and I didn't see anyone mastering the end game, meaning they didn't leave smiling and waving goodbye. They left feeling that they hadn't gotten their due. They didn't get enough acknowledgement, or they hadn't done something. They were being pushed out. They never wanted to, when they retired, they never wanted to give up their offices. It was really quite an amazing. I was a chair at one point, and when people retired, they just didn't want to give up anything, even though there was no space for young people to move in. It was a very interesting play of what it is to be a successful person. And I would say, very concerned, how does one build a model, in a sense, to transition out of work and then out of life, feeling that it was a good life, feeling that it was, the words I use is smile and wave goodbye. How do we do that? Where are the mentors for that part? They're mentors in terms of the upslope, but are there mentors in terms of the downslope of this life cycle? And the answer is very few.
Is this where you mentioned earlier in your talk that the realm of mythology and philosophy and literature and that sort of stuff can we use that sort of stuff to make that end game a bit more of a transition?
You can go into like hero's journey and stuff like that, or even going into anthropology and like Margaret Mead stories. I mean, I think First Nations, if you in Australia, may have in some strategies that may be really useful if incorporated into I would say the contemporary world. And so there's, people who have lived with each other, as opposed to seeing each person as a resource of productivity, may have a different perspective. And I think we need to find the wisdom in myth, find the wisdom in history. And when I say find the wisdom, I'm almost saying find the neurobiological consequences of these stories. They're not devoid of a neurophysiology.
Yeah, it does. For many people, it does create that reason to engage in these activities if they know that, hey, this affects me in this particular way. And that's why I think there's more of a resurgence, at least from a clinical point of view, to understand why the different interactions or interventions can help from a neurological basis. Is that what you have seen?
Yeah, well, I would also say, what is it that we want out of life? And for me, I won't talk about what I want. I will tell you what I've learned from two different vectors now. One is the world of trauma, and the other is the pandemic. And there's a convergence. The only thing important under those two challenges is relationships with others. I mean, if you think about it, you think about the world of trauma. The world of trauma tells you what is lost in a human being's repertoire by having a severe trauma history. The ability to trust another, the ability to feel safe enough to be in the arms of another. I don't mean totally safe, but safe enough to send cues of acceptance and warmth to another. Now, those who have experienced severe adversity still have the dream. They have the vision of that as a goal in life. But when proximity of another comes too close on both, let's say, a psychological space or physical space, their bodies retract in defense because they don't feel safe enough to be in that. So the intervention model is to enable the body to feel safe enough to be in proximity with another. The pandemic is another interesting window into it, into our own, I would say, frailties and our own needs. The pandemic is threat. That's what it is, it's threat. It doesn't mean it's threat of death, but it's threat of disease, threat of a pathogen. And due to that, we try to reduce that threat. How? Through isolation, social isolation. But what is the worst thing that a human, and by the way, other social mammals, isolation is the worst thing, meaning that this is not what we like as humans. We want to interact with others. And so now others become a threat. And that really, quote, messes us up because our bodies want to hug and engage, but the presence of another is now a cue of threat. And it retunes our autonomic nervous system. So now without the experience and diversity of feeling safe with others, our nervous system gets retuned to have a lower threshold to detect threat. And that keeps us in this almost hypervigilant state. And now we are, in a sense, a traumatized species. We no longer give up our threat reactions. We're just not safe. And we see this in culture in terms of in the US with politics and everything, and even the vaccines, where as a social group, we should be concerned with all of us. But what people are saying, it's just me. That's all I need to take care of. And when do we become so self-serving or self-preserving? It's when we're under threat. It's a natural response. But what we forget is that when we feel safe and we are co-regulating with others, and when sociality works as that neuromodulator, we are benevolent. We're a benevolent species. We reach out, we enjoy helping, we enjoy being with others. So it's not like we don't get benefits. We like that. We enjoy it. It's part of who we are. It's not a operational, I give to you, you give back to me. When I give to you, when I'm a good host, I feel good. And this is kind of like an inside story with my home. My wife's a great host, but she doesn't like to take from others. When I keep telling her she has to learn to be a good guest, that when we travel or used to travel, people want to be, they want to be generous. They want to be welcoming. And you want, as a good guest, you understand that. And you become a good recipient of their giving. And, you know, when people, in a sense, grow up in certain environments, they're basically almost taught not to take. And they are taught not to take. And the issue is, in doing that, they're creating boundaries of this interaction. And if we start thinking about even our neurobiology of this co-regulation, giving and taking, and why food has historically been a neurobiological mechanism to create social relationships, because the ingested behavior of suck, swallow, and breathing utilizes the same mechanisms as our social engagement system and calms us down and makes us more accessible. And you see this at birth with the baby who suckles and calms down. It's really this remarkable circuit. It's really the face and head heart circuit that calms us down. Ingestion is just a shortcut. So when we always say, when we meet someone and we want to start a social relationship, let's go out for coffee, go out for a drink, go out for a snack or something like that.
I never thought about it like that, Steve. That's remarkable. So just the pure act of sharing a meal, something that people have been doing for thousands and thousands of years. You've got it written on cave walls, you know, and this sort of stuff.
You got Polyvagal Theory on the cave wall, you see?
Yes. Oh gosh, that's a really good one. I want to pick up on your theme of COVID, pandemic, lockdowns. I'm here in Australia. Melbourne, particularly, you may have heard, has been crowned the lockdown capital of the world. We've been in lockdown more than any other state and other country in terms of cumulative lockdowns. Now, Steve, I have seen firsthand the effects that lockdowns have on the people that I treat, myself, family members, people in the general population. It really takes a toll to be constrained in one home. And even when you're walking out, say somebody is wearing a face mask or somebody is not wearing a face mask, there's like there almost feels like
well, okay, let's go right to this meaty point of what's going on now. In the United States, over 800,000 people have already died. 800,000. How many have died in Australia?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. A couple thousand, I think there has been.
Okay, 800,000 in the state of Florida where I live. 60 plus thousand have died, and the issue is this is a lot. 800,000 is a lot of people, and many of them, if not most, need not have died. The issue is, first of all, vaccines help a lot, and so does wearing masks. But when masks become political and vaccines become political, people don't follow the rules. So now people truly become threats to other people. And so we went to a restaurant today. We wear a mask to go in. We sit down. We have a booth far away from other people. We don't go often. Usually we go at an outdoor restaurants. Florida has a good outdoor season, but there are people without masks, and there are people talking as if doesn't exist, and treating masks as if it is you're one of them. Not that anyone said that to me because I'm an older person, but again, there are numbers. We do know that if you're over 65, basically that's where the deaths are occurring. So in the US, the older people, at least in Florida, well, actually in the whole country, but in Florida, I think it's over 90% are fully vaccinated or close to full, or are vaccinated, not necessarily fully. But the numbers are really quite good for the old people. But the old people have other things going on. They have pre-existing conditions. They're on medications. It's a very interesting situation because rather than seeing it as a problem for everyone, it's seen as someone else's problem. And if you keep people in a state of threat, it's difficult for them to evaluate the relative risks, because that's when your body's in that state, that's not what you're evaluating. I say that, being a scientist, I can evaluate and I can come up with benefit risks. I made a statement on a podcast or a conference, and I got some pushback because I made a comment saying that people who weren't vaccinated were in a state of threat. And I think what I really said is that when you're in a state of threat, you may not interpret the data, and you may be less welcoming to any form of intervention because you now see those as other forms of risk. I think the latter, the way I'm saying it now, I think people are retuned to see greater threat when the threat may not be the same. So when we were talking about when the background noises and the rumble of the place and my body gets into a threat reaction and I'm making a narrative and I'm blaming you, I'm creating a story. I think when we're in the same state of physiological destabilization, we'll create a story, and the story will not have this objective reality that we would like. Now, what the person said was that I was really saying that if people don't agree with me, they must be in a state of threat. And what I really was saying, I'm even in a state of threat. And the issue is that when we're in states of threat, we have to be very cautious about our decisions.
And everyone evaluates, as you said, their threat, their stress, their demographic, their age, their medical history in a different way, and make a decision based on that. It just appears that I've only been alive 31 years, and I haven't seen as much division in my life as I have seen in the past 2 years, which makes me consider, how is this having an impact on our nervous systems, on our ability to connect? How are we going to get out of this? How are we going to move forward? Do you have thoughts on those?
I do. I think we need to first take that deep breath and exhale slowly. And we have to actually realize where the vagal modulators are, where the neuromodulations of calming come from. They come from social interactions. They come from intonation of voice. They come from melodic music. There are things we know. They come from movement and social interaction, team sports, or things that people do to calm themselves down. We need to bring them back into our repertoire. We've basically focused, even during the pandemic, that the only thing that was necessary was to maintain the channels of cognitive functioning. So it was basically online school. It wasn't online romping around or dancing or singing but it was all about the pipeline of information into the cortex. And the body, under those demands, is going to also, in a sense, rebel. I think what you're really sensing is the rebellion of the body. And it doesn't mean that we don't know what to do. What we are, in a sense, the structures of institutions don't know what to do. And we start off by saying intention is not necessarily bad, the intentions, but the implementation doesn't optimize the human experience. And this is where we start the whole idea. What is polyvagal theory? It's about optimizing and understanding the human experience. And the theme here is, if we understand that the pandemic has retuned and continues to retune our autonomic nervous system to a state that is more consistent with defensive reactions, meaning we're in a state of threat, then our social lives and social behavior will not be as complementary, meaning fitting together, that type of complement, or synchronous as it should be, could be, and hopefully will be. The problem is, and we're getting there. I really feel that there's an acknowledgement of what the risk is. When the pandemic first came, we didn't know if you could touch the same things that other people touch. So we would have people bring groceries, and we'd have to, in a sense, wash the groceries before we ate it. We kind of know that if you wear a mask, if you wash your hands, if you go outside and eat outside at restaurants, you should be reasonably good, unless you are really, really compromised. So we have a better understanding that we can have more flexibility. And we know that certain people who have fully vaccinated and boosted, who interact with the same types of people, they should be fine for social networks. But we really haven't implemented, it's a really compromise of a free society. We haven't implemented safe places. So, and I'm not sure how we do that without compromising individual freedoms. I think this becomes a bit, so if schools could be safe places, what does that mean? It means the kids are inoculated, the teachers are inoculated, and their parents are inoculated. Then does that create, in a sense, enough flexibility? In the US, I mean, the numbers are still horrendous compared to what you have in Australia. We're basically, as a culture, saying we're living with this. And I would say that it was like 6 months into it, and then the system basically gave up, and it even started not even to report the testing results, not providing tests. So it started with the adaptive reaction was denial. Things aren't as bad. It will blow when it gets warmer. Everything will be fine. And I think things are much, much better because you can get tests, you can get shots, and that's all there. And there's a culture in certain places of accepting masks. And that gives you the flexibility now to basically go see your fellow citizens, your fellow inhabitants. It's hard. I thought, for me, I would say the first couple of months were the hardest. I couldn't. I had been traveling a lot. I would travel once or twice a month. Every couple of months, an international trip. Having fun, being a good guest. Enjoying things, but. That went, in a sense, cold turkey. It went into total withdrawal, and we were basically locked down. Now, fortunately, I was with my wife. Now, many people didn't have a significant other, and other people may not like their significant other, and then you start getting all these other issues going on. So, in many aspects, for me, it's been fine. But I would also emphasize that I know that my nervous system got retuned. I know that a thought of travel, which I used to love, the thought of going to the airport is upsetting to me. The thought of going to the airport, thought of going into the airport lounge, getting your drink or your snack before the flight, which I always used to kind of enjoy as preparation. The thought of being on an airplane really bothers me, especially with the news about people acting out on planes and people being duct taped to their chairs. Just the image of those things are enough to agitate me and say, that's not what I want, because travel to me was fun. It was exciting. I enjoyed it. So I'm not ready for that. And I'm trying to now, I would say I'm trying to re-educate my nervous system. Yeah. And I think we live in a lovely place. We live oceanfront. So prior to the pandemic, we had a lot of visitors, especially from the more northern states. Lots of friends would, come down. It was really great. So, once a month or a couple of times, people come for a few days, and they're people you like, and you're socializing, feeling good and feeling special that you live on the ocean. So you have this nice kind of feeling. Take people to restaurants, you're feeling really good, and that's gone. And that part of my life, that interaction with close friends, is very, very compromised. So I feel that I need to bring my friends down to kind of rehabilitate me, but also I need to do a live event. So, I was getting lots, these workshops and lectures, and it was very, I would say, socially nourishing. So it was like, it wasn't, it's exhausting on one level, but it's not. In a sense, the interaction with the others really made me feel good. I'd meet new people. They'd tell me their stories. And I felt good about all this. So I'm going to try to do a live event in the town where I live. There's a lovely hotel, and I'm trying to organize this so that this would be my ability, in a sense, to reach back into a physical reality of interacting with others.
And it comes back to connection. I can relate to so much of what you've just said. Just the thought of holidaying brings back a real ambivalence. It's like, because over the past 2 years, 3 of our trips have been meddled with, and first one was cancelled, second one we traveled and then we were in lockdown in the state that we'd traveled to, the third one had to be cancelled, and now my wife is like, well, the borders are starting to open up again. I'm just like, I don't know if I want to do anything.
Because you're retuned. You're getting retuned. And the answer is, see, the way the therapist would deal with this, I'm not the therapist, you are, is to say, there's no real danger. It's all perceived danger. But there is real danger. That is the issue is. So that's the part that I have to deal with, especially being an older individual, is there is vulnerability. So I can't say to myself, you just go through it and then you'll be fine. The answer is there's a risk, and the risk is different for me than it is for you. But the risk is really, I would say, relatively high. And then what I'm learning, is that a lot of people that I know who traveled, who were, quote, careful and then vaccinated, got so-called breakthroughs. And the symptoms that they experienced varied from nothing to relatively severe. No one was hospitalized, so they're all alive. But is that something I want to deal with either? Because what we're learning from our own research then doing is the impacts of COVID on autonomic reactivity and on their own subjective sense of bodily reaction. Basically, it messes up their autonomic nervous system and retunes it to be into a state of more chronic threat. So when we talk about long haul COVID or the consequences of it, it's really that the autonomic nervous system is stuck in a state of threat and didn't get the message that the pathogen is no longer viable.
Is that through inflammation of body systems?
It's if we think about neuroinflammatory, neuroautonomic, it's not in a sense, the physiological state is basically a state of threat, and it's not serving an adaptive function because the pathogen's gone. It's like chronic pain. You have chronic pain, but you have no damage or no site of injury. The injury is healed. The nervous system got into a state of defense, which pain is, or part of, but didn't get the message that the injury is healed. So that's how, where I'm thinking, are therapies that are very, quote, polyvagal in form, sending a message that everything is safe, may be very helpful in downregulating those threat reactions. So I'm kind of working in that space now to try to, in a sense, create an intervention model.
Oh, I've got so many questions, so many pathways I'd love to explore with you, but we only have a limited time left. So I would like to leave it open to you, Steve. What to talk about either the safe and sound protocol or something else that you would like to bring up, if there is that time.
Well, yeah, there's always creativity, always things. So one of the things that I am working on is developing a novel devices that can measure what I call vagal efficiency. I think we looked at vagal tone and we didn't, basically people bought in and didn't ask the real question, and that is, how much good is it doing you? So in a sense, is the vagal brake working? Is it effectively regulating your heart rate? You might have a strong vagal brake, so it looks like it's good, but does it go on and off dynamically to enable your heart rate to regulate and calm down? So it's like you get destabilized and you have a brake, but is the brake now coming on or is it destabilized? So when you exercise, do you calm down rapidly or do you not? Mm-hmm. So I developed a metric called vagal efficiency, and I'm now working with the same company that actually is distributing the Safe and Sound protocol to create this device where people can literally monitor and evaluate this vagal efficiency. We're finding out that many individuals who carry diagnoses of dysautonomia, meaning the autonomic nervous system isn't working right, it pops up in this vagal efficiency. And we know that trauma downregulates vagal efficiency, and we know that diseases of dysautonomia do as well. So we know we have a hint, and I really would like to see this. I want to see a large database. Now, the Safe and Sound protocol was really, I would say, a theoretical experiment. It was like saying, based on what we know about the polyvagal theory, and we know about the neural regulation of middle ear structures, and we know that when people have disorders of the nerves that control the middle ear muscles, that they become hypersensitive to sound. Bell's palsy is your natural experiment, which is a lateralized paralysis of the facial nerve, but the facial nerve also controls one of the middle ear muscles, the stapedius. And one of the symptoms of Bell's palsy is hypersensitivity. So we know that that is a phenomenon. The question is, can you send a cue to the nervous system that there is safety in the vocalizations, and will the nervous system now, in a sense, meet it halfway? The bottom line here is that when we're under threat, we want to hear low frequency sounds because that is basically the evolutionary story. When we're under threat, we evolved as from very small mammals that really were populated the earth when reptiles were the dominant species. And the mammals were basically food, and reptiles produce their acoustic system detected low frequency sound because they didn't have middle ear bones. The middle ear bones broke off the jawbone in the transition to mammals. And that enabled mammals to have a frequency band that the reptiles could hear. And that became a frequency band of social communication based on the physics or size of the middle ear structures. So we have a frequency band that's wired into us that is where social communication occurs. It's a mother's lullaby. It's not a bass fiddle, it's a violin. So the answer is that there are certain frequencies that we can't say no to. Our nervous system says, I'm all yours. And then it reacts and it calms the body down. And this is what the Safe and Sound protocol was doing, was saying we can create, through the filtering of vocal music, we can amplify the intonation features that are in the frequency that your body can't say no to. And this was working really great with children on spectrum and individuals with auditory hypersensitivities. But, my footprint was in the world of trauma. So people in the world of trauma wanted to try this. And I was very excited to see what would happen. And often there would be a therapist who was a trauma therapist with a trauma history, herself or himself, and they would try it at home. It says break the rules of signals of safety in isolation as opposed to signals of safety with a safe companion. And they would get adverse reactions, meaning they would get very anxious, very mobilized. They would have bodily feelings. But what it was doing was their body calmed down and they became accessible, but not accessible really. They became vulnerable. So we have to understand that when we are healthy and our nervous systems work, accessibility is where we want to be. But if we have a trauma history, that opening up of this ventral area is vulnerability. So when the body calmed, it became vulnerable and closed off. And this really set off a cascade of interesting observations and treatment modifications, because it told us that you could utilize this stimulus in a titrated manner. And you could move people into this experience and allow their bodies to resolve, very similar to the methodology embedded in somatic experiencing, titration, as Peter Levine calls it. But basically, in polyvagal terminology, you're challenging the nervous system and you're allowing it to recover. You're challenging it and you're allowing it to recover. And there have been some really remarkable, breakthroughs. And what people have said is that it's an adjunctive therapy. It's not a therapy for trauma, but people who are trauma therapists, whether they're somatic experiencing or internal family systems, or there's several others, EMDR, there are actually a subset of practitioners in all these groups who are using the Safe and Sound protocol and building hybrid treatment models. And they all say it accelerates the treatment model because it's functionally a state shifter. It calms the body down and enables them to do their work. And there's somatic therapists, body workers using it as well, in a sense, enabling the body to be more accessible.
So on that point, and before I let you go, when it comes to the sounds that are being administered, are these sounds that a person can replicate within their own body, or does it have to come out of a device?
It comes out of a device because it takes sounds that humans make and then computer alters them. It basically amplifies processes. So if you think of music, vocal music, as already being hyperprosodic, this just amplifies the frequency, intonation changes. It is a patented procedure. And my goal is to basically make it universal for all forms of music. But right now, it basically uses, I would say, canned music. But I want to make it as a dynamic system, meaning that people could listen to whatever they want, and this would process it. Then you can go to the movies, you could watch cartoons, you could do whatever you want. And it says doing this dynamic filtering.
That's huge. Where can people find more information on this?
They can go to my webpage, stephenporges.com, and then they can click on the Safe and Sound protocol, and it will send them to integrated listening systems. Now, what I also wanted to mention,
I was going to say, I will put those details in the description of these episodes. But continue.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that we created a not-for-profit Polyvagal Institute that we just launched within the past year. And the Institute is really creating educational courses that apply polyvagal theory to many different, I would say, subdisciplines, education, martial arts, even yoga, and we're creating one for physicians as well within this, occupational therapists. It's really interesting because people see the application. Actually, there is an architect who's developing a course as well, an architecture of polyvagal theory.
Right.
It's the Rubik's Cube, it's all there. It just rotated. People in their own discipline, they see it, and they're developing these courses. And that's polyvagalinstitute1word.org. And we had an online summit at the beginning of November. And interesting, we had over 700 people from several countries online. And that was our first summit, but that was less than a year of, in a sense, going live with a website. So we're very thrilled by it. Oh, there's a group, has a bunch of Facebook affinity groups, including those who are dealing with polyvagal theory and addiction. That group alone has over 700 people connecting already. So it's becoming a hub for people interested in polyvagal theory and to find a niche group, including, so there are different therapists. And it's actually, I'm sitting back and watching it grow. I find it very interesting.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that information, because I'll link that down, and anyone who is interested, including myself, will go into it and find out a little bit more about it. So thank you so much for joining us here today, Steve. And before we end, is there anything you'd like to say before we wind up? Anything you may have missed?
Well, the only thing I'd like to say is that, what this pandemic has done, it's retuned us, but it's also taught us what's important in life. And it's going to help us set our priorities straight. And our priorities are to be a social species and to be connected with others. And that trust is not a vulnerability. Trust is how we, in a sense, are nourished through our interactions with others.
What a wonderful way to end. Thank you so much, Dr. Porges, and thank you.
You're quite welcome, Emil. Nice seeing you. Take care.